Dr. Gad Sad is joining us now here on the Will Cain Show. He's a friend. He's been on the show a lot. He's also a visiting professor and global ambassador at Northwood University. He's the author of The Parasitic Mind and a new book coming up called Suicidal Empathy, which we're going to be talking about today, Dr. Sad. But if I might, Gad,
Sure.
you've been listening to both Donald Trump and the Will Cain Show today. I think there is a thematic, I always think one of the most interesting things ever said about Donald Trump is that the left takes him literally but not seriously. The right takes him seriously but not literally. Today, he is saying things that should, at least 5 years ago, make the left totally lose their minds and probably censor him. But there's also a serious thematic tie of restructuring, reprioritizing the world order where America thinks of itself and what serves its interests first and sort of holds everyone accountable to common sense. What are your thoughts on what's being said right now by Donald Trump?
I mean, I didn't follow all that he said, but to your general point about America, might is right. That's evolutionary history, right? I mean, history is shaped by the following dynamics. There are two tribes on each side of the river, and each of the two tribes looks at the resources of the other one with envy. And the only thing that stops them from attacking the other tribe is that there are other men in the other tribe that are formidable and would not take kindly to them attacking them. And it is that dynamic that keeps things in check. Now, imagine if a civilization says, no more of that evolutionary imperative of protecting what's ours, of exhibiting kindness, but always with a big stick behind our backs, but rather we're always going to be infinitely kind, infinitely compassionate, infinitely tolerant, even to those who wish to destroy us. That's not a good cocktail, and that's why we end up with the kind of quagmire that we see today in the West.
You know what's fascinating about this analogy, this metaphor you've given us of two tribes across a river? If we were to take that analogy and adjust it for modern times, which you began to there in your answer, is say, okay, but the scenario in modern, at least when it comes to the West, and certainly when it comes to America, is that one tribe is incredibly more powerful than the other tribe. And to your point, historically, might has been right. But that doesn't seem in a lot of ways the way the might views itself today. So the powerful tribe on one side of the river attempts to placate the other tribe, to your point, with kindness. And oftentimes now the other tribe is the one resorting to violence or threats of coercion and force. That can manifest in many different ways. It can even manifest in cancel culture, which was driven by a radical minority. In other words, not the might side of the equation. But they got their way through force and coercion. Sometimes they could threaten your job. Sometimes they threaten your reputation, call you a racist. Sometimes they threaten whatever it may be. And it's like, to me, you're 100%, I love your analogy because we can rationalize. We can say, well, but you should deal logically like this, or you should be empathetic and think of it this. But in the end, it's like, hey, if you keep responding to me in this coercive manner, guess what? I own more coercion. Like, at what point am I forced into the role of force, meaning I being the world power, the side of might? The might has handcuffed itself in many ways and said, I guess I'll let myself be forced and coerced, or I'll even be forced into immoral or wrong situations because I should feel guilty about being mightyful, And at some point, the might is just going to go, time to flex.
Right. So a couple of things I'll say here. Robert Axelrod, a famous political scientist in the 80s, ran simulations of what is the optimal strategy. And when two parties are interacting with each other. And so the reciprocal tit for tat strategy turned out to win, which is begin with the first move as, kind and altruistic, and then watch what the other one does, and then simply reciprocate whatever they do. So if they act kindly, you act kindly. If they act nastily, then you replicate that. And of all the possible modeling strategies, that's the one that wins. Now, it didn't need a fancy political scientist, I think he was at University of Michigan, to understand that there is a relationship, a causal relationship between things. If you do A, I'll do B. Now imagine if we break that thing whereby it's completely parasitic. It's only one way. I grant you endless empathy, but I never expect anything of you in return. And let me add one more fancy professorial content. I wrote an article
Hmm.
about a year ago on something that I coined cultural theory of mind. Theory of mind is something that is innate to human sociality. It's when I put myself in your brain, Will, in order to be able to think, well, what is he thinking right now? And then we can engage in a fruitful dialogue, right? Autistic children, by the way, lack theory of mind. That's one of the ways that you're able to diagnose them early as being autistic, because you can give them a theory of mind test, which they fail. Well, imagine now if I argue that there is a cultural theory of mind blindness, whereby the West thinks that kindness, compassion, empathy, magnanimity will be reciprocated, but the other group thinks of each of those things as manifestations of weakness. So they don't look at it as
Mm.
beautiful things to be reciprocated. They see it as weakness, 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 and weakness. That's why I explained on, I can't remember which show it was, that when I speak to people in Arabic, they historically have told me, we can't believe how the West acts. For us, the West is a woman to be mounted. Arabic is a very powerful and flowery language, but that's exactly what it is. Weakness, magnanimity is viewed as weakness. The quicker that we can get our politicians to understand theory of mind, the better off we'll be.
I want to get into suicidal empathy, but since you brought up Arabic and it's a current event, I would do, and you have contributed to this conversation unfolding on one platform on X. We talked about it yesterday. So these grooming gangs of Pakistani Muslim men in the UK who are raping young women, and has been happening, I believe, for, I don't know, Dr. Sad, like, is it a 15-year time frame? Is that a fair, like, at least that's when it's
that
been,
would be a
at least
conservative one. We
that's
could
when
go
it's been
back
revealed.
20 to 30. Sorry?
I think that's when it's been revealed. But you're pointing
Yeah,
out it was going on before it was even discussed
exactly.
at all, right?
Yes.
20 to 30 years.
Yeah.
It's talk to me about this, because, okay, there's several levels of interest to this story. One is the cultural diagnosis of what's going on in South Asia, Pakistan, wherever this is taking place. We know about what's happening in Afghanistan. We've heard from American soldiers who've come back and seen what's taking place in Afghanistan. But then the second level, perhaps even more interesting, is the way that it was handled in the UK, which is back to how the West views itself, kind of what we're talking about here, and the way it was covered up. It was like, and the best way I've seen this written, Dr. Sad, is the UK was more in love with the image, the perfect image of multiculturalism, than the truth of multiculturalism.
Exactly right. Look, I mean, and hence that's exactly why the British grooming gangs is front and center in my forthcoming book, Suicidal Empathy, because you are rejecting, you are destroying the integrity, the bodily integrity of arguably hundreds of thousands of children at the altar of appearing infinitely tolerant, right? So it's a consequentialist ethic. Yes, it would be nice for us to speak out on these issues. But if we do that, then we will marginalize the hundreds of thousands of Pakistani men who are perfectly kind and lovely. I mean, what kind of insane logic is that? That would be like arguing, don't go after male serial killers, because by going after male serial killers, you will marginalize my dad and my brother, who are also male, but who are not serial killers. It's insane right now. By the way, there's a whole range of retorts that you typically get from people. Either they are Muslim themselves or they're Western protectors, to try to justify why it was perfectly reasonable to do the cover up, right? Here is one. They put up pictures of endless white pedophiles, as if that is a valid argument for why you shouldn't go after Pakistani Muslim pedophiles, right? Nobody questions the fact that there are nasty Jewish pedophiles, there are atheist pedophiles, there are Christian pedophiles as per the Catholic Church. So there isn't a monopoly of degeneracy. But that doesn't mean that because that holds true, we don't say that when it comes to the epidemiological realities of what's been happening for the past 20 or 30 years in Britain, there tends to be one group that is grossly overrepresented per capita. And the inability to
There
simply
you
say
go.
what I just said is absolutely insane. It is suicidal.
And I was going to say this phrase if you did not, this pair of wording, per capita. Whenever they do this, they lose the entire ability to understand per capita. I saw a stat this morning that I think it was 3.5 times. So that a British Pakistani Muslim rate of whatever pedophilia, statutory rape, all these, whatever, however this crime is categorized, was 3.5 times more likely per capita than if it happened, whatever, a white male Brit. It's per capita an issue. And then you have to get to the why. And the why is the most important part. Like, is there a cultural tolerance of it, a cultural acceptance of it? And we know the answer to these things because we can also see the rates of prevalence of it back in home culture, right? We can go back and say, what's happening in Afghanistan? What's happening in Pakistan? And therefore, then you have to deal with cultural relevancy. If you can say, okay, happening more per capita, therefore tied to culture. And by the way, that doesn't mean everybody within the culture practices this degeneracy. But if it happens at a greater rate in this culture, then you start comparing cultures and going, you know what? This is not a better culture, at least in this respect. And therefore, the majority culture, the might culture in this scenario, doesn't have to self-flagellate and go, oh, we're terrible, we can't condemn. This is kind of back to where we started, like the might is right thing. And Donald Trump, this speech he's giving today, he's reorganizing what you said. If you do A, I do B. That's what his whole speech is saying, basically. But we can't have these honest conversations because I don't know what it is. I guess, is it we're supposed to pretend that all cultures are of equal value in the end? There is no bad culture.
They are all equal, except that the West is less equal, right? So, and this is why, this is why I refer to cultural relativism as one of the key parasitic ideas in my 2020 book, The Parasitic Mind. Cultural relativism was an idea that was developed by cultural anthropologists who were worried that the misuse of biology, for example, arguing that there is a innate universal human nature, might result in all sorts of nefarious political agents misusing biology. Say, for example, Hitler, right? There is a race, but there's a struggle between the races. We are the Aryans, you are the Jews. Sorry, Jews, you lost, and the Aryans won, right? So because of that, cultural anthropologists developed a whole new edifice of knowledge where you completely abdicated the role of biology in explaining human affairs. One of which is, who are we to judge the mores of another society? If another society views it within their religious text that it is perfectly permissible to cut off the clitorises of 5-year-old girls, shut up, cultural imperialists. Don't offer any moral judgment to that. So imagine how much that makes you impotent to weigh in on issues if I suddenly lose the reflex to be disgusted at the idea that little girls are going to face female genital mutilation. No. I do judge. I have the capacity as a free human being to say, you don't have the right to cut off the clitorises of little girls. And if you think I'm a cultural imperialist, F you.
So, okay. Now let's tie this into a debate that you're having, Dr. Sad, with a guy that I know, a coworker, Piers Morgan. This took place on X, and we can put up some of the exchange that you had with Piers. Piers had talked about having Tommy Robinson, who's a guy in the UK who's been highlighting, putting a megaphone behind these problems going on in the UK for quite some time. And I guess he was on Piers Morgan's program, and Piers accused him of being Islamophobic, okay? And that's what Piers said. I said he was Islamophobic, which he is. You responded to Piers. You said, Piers, and you were very, very respectful, by the way. You said, please forgive me for questioning you publicly, but what do you mean by Islamophobic specifically? Could you provide a framework under which scrutiny of Islam and its values and constitute fair criticism versus what falls under the rubric of Islamophobia? Perhaps I could ask you the following question. Do you think that the incursion of Islam in Britain has been a net benefit to your country? If so, how? And if not, would this be Islamophobic? He responded to you, by the way, Dr. Sad, and he said, yes, it is a net benefit. He said Islamophobic means having or showing a dislike of or prejudice against Islam or Muslims. Tommy Robinson is on the record saying these things, and it meets the criteria. Regarding the UK, I think the vast majority of Muslims here are a benefit to our society.
I hope you're going to read my response
What
to
is
that.
basically, yeah. So you ask basically, define your terms. What is Islamophobia?
Well, so basically what I said is, to sort of summarize my retort, which people can go and check it on my feed. I said, look, number one, I can criticize communism without harboring any hate to individual Soviets. Let's go back to before the Soviet Union collapsed, right? So the socio-political economic ideology called communism has a set of tenets which I may either wholeheartedly support or think that they are abhorrent and contrary to human nature. And I could criticize those without holding zero hate towards Igor the Soviet. Yes? By the exact same logic, It doesn't take a fancy evolutionary behavioral scientist. By the exact same logic, I can harbor zero hate towards Muslims as individuals. I know more Muslims who are friends of mine than most people will ever meet by virtue of the fact that I'm from Lebanon. But I could make statements about Islam that in no way could constitute what Pierce is referring to as Islamophobia. Does Islam promote sexual liberation of women? If yes, okay. If no, then let's talk about it. Does Islam have orgiastic love or hate towards the Jews? What's the position of Islam? But Pierce can't do that because for Pierce, he's been inculcated with the Western reflex that to criticize anyone's religion is gauche, right? You don't talk about politics at the dinner table and you never talk about religion. Except if you are criticizing Christianity, in which case you could put a crucifix in urine and call it art, and we all applaud. That's okay. That's progressive. But don't you dare ever criticize Islam. It's Islamophobic. Now, he replied to me, but I just wrote to him before I came on the show saying, I'm going on a show on Fox. I'll respond shortly. So stay tuned. There's more to come with Pierce.
Okay. Well, you should have said the Will Cain show because that really would have chapped his hide. You're doing it not on Piers Morgan tonight, but you're doing it on the Will Cain show. Oh, okay. I'm so glad you corrected me earlier on something. I said, am I required to believe in cultural relativism? And you corrected that. It's not that we have to believe that all cultures are equal, because what we're really required to believe, as you just pointed out in like you can put a crucifix in urine, is that the West culturally is actually inferior to these other cultures. Yeah. And your new book, which I haven't read yet, is Suicidal Empathy. Now, I want to run this by you because I came across this thread, and off the top of my head, I cannot remember who wrote it, but I found it very thoughtful. You're familiar, Dr. Saad, with the heat map of concentric circles of left and right and where they extend empathy or where they extend their priorities or where how much they care. Have you seen this?
I don't know the circle that you're speaking of, but I make a similar argument in Suicidal Empathy, so I can get where you're going with it.
So the right gives its priority and its care to things closest to home. You know, God, family, friends, neighborhood, you know, local, state, on and on until you get to the furthest outreach circles is, you know, just as an example, Ukraine. The left's heat map looks like more care, more empathy on further outer rings of the concentric circles, more for Ukraine than the neighbor or the family. So the argument made by this person on X was, we make the mistake of often thinking that the left is driven by empathy, you know, a care for others. And in your case, you argue for its suicidal nature in many cases. He says, and I'm real careful of this, Dr. Saad, because I don't want to project the worst motivations on my opponents at all occasions, but I found this thoughtful, not partisan. He said it's actually driven by hate. He said it is a hatred of what is similar to you and ultimately what is you. It's ultimately driven by a self-hatred. So what that means is I hate people in my socioeconomic class. I hate people that look like me in my race. I hate people that live like me in my neighborhood. I hate my family. Ultimately, I hate me. It's all driven from something psychologically internally, and this is how the left is actually being driven. Instead of by empathy, it's at its core being driven by a self-hatred, something they recognize in themselves that they hate, something they see in their family that they hate, something they see in people of the same race as them that they hate, and on and on and on. And that's why their empathy is so far away and theoretical.
So I do discuss these kinds of issues. The question, if I'm questioning the framework of the person that you were reading the thread from, why does that hate exist? And so I offer some explanations. Actually, I was working on that section yesterday in the book. So take, for example, the mechanism of survivor guilt, right? So this is the idea in as a psychiatric condition where the plane crashes, and within your row, the four people next to you all died, but you survived. And then as you walk away, at first you're happy and elated, hey, I survived. But then you are completely shackled by this ruminative thought of, but why did I survive? Existentially, I feel guilty now that these four lovely people that I was having a chat with died. Why should I survive? And then that can become very debilitating. Now, let's take this mechanism and apply it to the West. If I am a progressive, I think that there is something inherently icky about the fact that I have these riches, but whereas poor Hondurans don't, whereas people in Namibia don't have the same opportunities as I do. And that's why I am self hating. And hence, the way that I remedy that self hate, that existential survivor guilt, is that I become orgiastically empathetic to the other. Screw my children. It's Honduran children that are really important. Screw American
Mm-hmm.
vets. It's Honduran or El Salvador MS-13 gang members that I should be really funding with free phones and free healthcare. And so I think both the explanation that you gave and the framework that I'm creating can be fitted together to explain the phenomenon.
I think that's right. I think empathy is a generous motivation to extend to people who only have empathy far from home. But I don't think it is mutually exclusive, but rather tied to the idea it's hatred for what is similar and ultimately hatred within that is driving a lot of this. Now, I also always want to say I don't think it's healthy to ascribe the worst of human motivations to people that disagree with you or who might be your opponent. And you always need to look yourself in the mirror and say, what is driving my motivations? It's not, but I did find this very thoughtful, as I know you will be in suicidal empathy. Donald Trump is just finished speaking at Mar-a-Lago. He talked about Joe Biden doing away with offshore drilling, the focus on electricity, moving everything to an electrical grid. He said he's in love with electricity and it's itchy. It's a bad way to heat a home. He talked about NATO paying its dues. He talked about not taking even military or economic coercion off the table when it comes to Panama Canal or Greenland. I say this as anyone now joining us here from Donald Trump's live stream as we react to that as well with Dr. Gad Saad today, is all tied together by this idea of re-engineering how you view the world, your role in the world. And by the way, this ties to what I'm talking about with Dr. Saad, not being driven by some fake suicidal empathy, but if you do A, I will do B, because I am more powerful and I trust in my own righteousness. Not that I'm infallible, not that I'm infallible, but I'm also not, as Western civilization, supposed to be apologetic for other cultures that we see, for example, in the UK, that have done horrible things. That's a recap as Donald Trump, by the way, has just finished speaking at Mar-a-Lago. Hey, speaking of cultures, Dr. Saad, who have some seeming sense of self-hatred, yours, Canadian culture. You guys just did away with Justin Trudeau. He just resigned. One of the most anti-free speech authoritarians in Western civilization. Not the most, because I think New Zealand takes the gold medal. But you're on the podium. He was on the podium for most anti-free speech Western leader. And here he is now stepping down. The question I had yesterday, though, is does Canadian culture allow for a man like Justin Trudeau, or does it allow for an alternative?
Well, I'd like to think that there's an autocorrection that's taking place. And so I do think that anyone, I mean, Ebola would have been a better prime minister than Justin Trudeau. He really, truly exemplifies all of the worst frailties that a human being can possess and none of the redeeming qualities, right? So even Jacinda Ardern, you mentioned New Zealand, I mean, she was grotesque, but she wasn't as personally corrupt as Justin Trudeau. He's a malignant narcissist. He's empty-headed. He's arrogant. He's vacuous. I mean, he's everything you can hope for in your biggest possible villain that you can, you know, come up with, engineer. So I do think that there is an autocorrection taking place. I think, of course, Pierre Poilievre will certainly be better, but I hold out my full optimism because the number one thing, in my view, that is affecting the future trajectory of Canada is the demographic changes that have taken place in Canada. And so there needs to be a stop of orgiastic immigration coming from countries that abhor our ways. And there needs to be a deportation of many people who don't share our ideals. Whether Pierre Poilievre is able to do it or not, I'm not sure, but at least I'm being optimistic that it'll be a better run.
You say it so well. That's what I talked about yesterday here in my first episode back from the Christmas break. It's like, it's what you and I are talking about. I don't believe in cultural relativism. I certainly believe in the supremacy of Western civilization. And I don't think we should be walking around with self-hatred and importing people who, as you point out, hate our way of life. We've seen the cost of that. We're watching right now the cost of that in the UK. You're doing something similar in Canada, and we are doing that here in the United States of America. You wake up one day and you are not you. And who you are, America, is pretty special on the entirety of the world stage and throughout human history. Pretty special. You brought up Pierre, and I'm not going to be able to say it because I don't speak French and I never will be. If you ranked languages that I am capable of just jumping in feet first to the deep end, treading water and pronouncing it right, for some reason, French is like really low for me. Pierre Poilievre?
I mean, if you said it French,
how am I doing?
Poilievre.
Poilievre. He is the potential next prime minister of Canada. He's a conservative leader, and he's really good. And that was really illustrated in a exchange he had with I believe it is a Canadian journalist. Let's watch together.
Is this the Apple story? Yes. Okay.
He's eating an apple.
On the topic, I mean, in terms of your sort of strategy currently, you're obviously taking the populist pathway.
What does that mean?
Well, appealing to people's more emotional levels, I would guess. I mean, certainly you tap very strong ideological language quite frequently.
Like what?
Left wing, this and that, right wing. I mean, it's that type of ideological thing.
I never really talk about left
but
or right.
Anyways, I don't
really believe in that.
Okay.
No, he goes on, and he's actually not mean. You and I both like rhetoric. We like ideas, and then rhetoric is the putting ideas into words. And he just destroys this reporter who bakes assumption after assumption with, what do you mean by that? Give me an example. Like what? What people say this? Who are you referencing? Because he also bakes in, like, people are saying you're saying this. He goes, what people? Who? And Elon Musk did this. I believe it was with, I don't remember which journalist he did it with.
Oh, I think it was with the BBC
CNBC,
guy.
maybe?
BBC, maybe?
Okay, BBC.
Maybe, yeah.
Just refuse to accept the assumptions baked into the question, which, again, I don't know much about Pierre Poilievre and his politics, but I sure do like his ability of logic and rhetoric here on display.
Can I add something? The prop of the apple is actually incredibly powerful because it reminds me, and this might be the first time that someone draws an analogy between that prop and spaghetti westerns of the 1960s. If you remember Clint Eastwood in the 60s, I didn't even speak English then. I was a young boy in Lebanon. Arabic was my mother tongue. But then Clint Eastwood comes into a town. He's always got that little small cigar, right? Well, that small cigar said a lot, right? Clint Eastwood didn't have to say much. He just had to kind of show up and do the little cigar thing. And I would say, I want to be that guy when I grow up. So that's what Pierre Poilievre invoked, right? Just very calm, very cool, and biting the apple. And that's how you get people. As you said, there is all sorts of ways of having powerful rhetoric. And in this case, the apple spoke a lot.
Oh, I think you're exactly right. I don't even, casual, cool. He's got his sunglasses in the same hand as the apple. Effortless. As he thinks through this. And then, by the way, posit the apple and the casualness of eating that apple as you intellectually destroy another human being with simple Socratic questions with the nervous laughter of the reporter. Constant nervous laughter that he tries to guise in some like arrogance or condescension, but it's really paper thin. It's
Why
not.
Is
he doesn't.
It that you
can see he doesn't
see
even
that?
believe it.
Why do you see it and I see it, but all of the progressives don't? What is it in our module, in our brain, that allows us to interpret these cues accurately, but they can't? Can you help me with that fancy lawyer?
Well, let's first start with this. Are we accurate? You always have to start there. So if the other side sees that interaction and maybe they see condescension and arrogance in Pierre Paul, I really can't do it, but
Polyev.
Pierre, if Polyev, and they don't see the condescension and insecurity in the reporter, we first have to start with, are we accurate? Of course we believe we are, or we wouldn't hold the opinion. I think, I don't know. I truly do believe that self-awareness is the key to wisdom. And that's why you hear me do this. I don't check my premises or look in the mirror because I'm a navel gazer or I'm insecure. I do it because I believe self-awareness is the grounding or the first step to wisdom. Like, you have to start with knowing yourself. And so I know how I would react.
The Delphic maxim, know thyself, has survived thousands of years, right? It's just 2 words, know thyself. That's why I always tell people, if you've got a self-help guru who's giving you all sorts of very, very broad, prescriptions to life with all sorts of specificity, he's a peddler of BS, right? Because just know thyself has stood the test of time, to your point. And you're exactly right. That's the start of wisdom. Spot on.
So what do you do when you're insecure? You do a fake laughter. That's what Kamala Harris did. And so I don't know why they don't see it. I don't know. I don't. It's the opposite of confirmation bias, right? Confirmation bias is, oh, he said something that I already believed, therefore it's right. And so the left looks at that scenario and says, Pierre Polyev.
Yeah, you're almost there.
Polyev he is the totalitarian. He is the arrogant one. And so here's the humble reporter simply speaking truth to power. And of course, all of his assumptions are correct. Of course, there's people saying you're an ideologue. Of course, there's people saying you're a populist. I don't know. I don't think they know themselves.
No, I think, but just to add to your point, I think that, so if I'm a progressive and I see that interaction, my mind and my senses completely shut out that nervous laugh of the reporter. All I see screaming at me is the next Hitler, right? Because he is conservative. Therefore, if he's conservative, he's probably going to round up all the indigenous people and the trans people. And so that's screaming at me. So my senses can't even pick up the condescension that you're speaking of, or the arrogance or the insecurity, because there's a much louder scream coming at me. It's called the label of conservative. So maybe that's why they don't see what we see.
I think that's right. I think this last topic I want to ask you about ties it together. So if there's a theme to you and I listening to Donald Trump today, the cultural repivot of even Facebook, and then bringing in what we're talking about with the UK grooming gangs and so forth, it's dealing with cultures and, knowing yourself, hating yourself versus, knowing yourself and understanding your role in human history and not taking on these other cultures because you believe there's something wrong with yourself. Joe Biden gave away, I don't know what it ended up being. Was it 24 or so Presidential Medal of Freedoms? And, it was Denzel Washington was included, Lionel Messi, your guy, Lionel Messi got one. Yeah.
But he didn't show up to it.
But he didn't show up. Yeah, I know. I don't know why. But George Soros got one. Yes, and I don't think there's ever been a better historical figure that illustrates the hatred of Western civilization and the funding of its dismantling than George Soros. And for that, by the current modern day American left, embodied by Joe Biden, he gets the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
It's unbelievable. And as did Hillary Clinton. So, imagine a world where Hillary Clinton and George Soros are lauded as bastions of freedom, but Elon Musk is completely ignored because, he's a billionaire guy who meddles in other people's affairs. So when Bill Gates meddles, good. When George Soros meddles, good. When Mark Zuckerberg meddles, good. When Elon does, he must be some sort of pro-apartheid monster from South Africa. It's absolutely insane. It's so hypocritical. It's so dishonest. But hopefully we're going to turn that ship around, Will.
I think there is a potential. Let me ask you that as we end, because it'll tie to Facebook. It does feel like a golden age in a bit, Dr. Sad. It does, or at least on the doorstep of a potential golden age. Because it feels like there is a cultural shift in America. Forget the leadership change for a moment. The leadership change is a reflection of a cultural change in America. And the question is, have we and can we shift to moving away from self-hatred of Western civilization and the exalted place of the United States of America? Can we do that? Is Facebook really recognizing this cultural shift? Are these corporate CEOs? Or are they just going, oh, you know what? The mogul on the ski hill currently reads as follows, and we need to jump down a few notches on the Donald Trump moguls.
Yeah. So to your point, I've often been asked, do you think that now that Donald Trump has gotten his second term, we're done with woke stuff? And my answer is an emphatic no. Is there reason to celebrate orgiastically? Absolutely, because the alternative would have been disastrous. But it took 50 to 100 years for all of these parasitic ideas and suicidal empathy and these reflex of self-hatred to be promulgated into every nook and cranny of our society. So it's going to take a lot more than just Donald Trump for the next 4 years to completely eradicate this. So don't be complacent. Yes, celebrate for a moment or two on January 20th, but there's a lot more work to be done to completely eradicate this nonsense. Hopefully it won't be 50 to 100 years, but it will be a lot more than just one term of Donald Trump.
All right, I know your fingers are itching to get back to X and go after Piers Morgan. So I'm going to let him go. But you listening at home, watching on YouTube and Facebook, need to know that he's already written The Parasitic Mind, this new book, which is, it's not just the centerpiece of the conversation we've had here today, but I think the centerpiece of a lot of what's happening. And we just hit 5 news stories, including the press conference today by Donald Trump, that I do think at a deep level is tied to the idea of suicidal empathy, the title of his upcoming book. It is Visiting Professor and Global Ambassador at Northwood University, Dr. Gad Saad. Always love talking to you, Gad. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Will. Cheers. Take care.